when peace collides with facts. Hold this point steady as we begin. Peace does not end because life becomes difficult. It ends because you demand that reality be different from what it is. Events arrive without intention. Delays occur. People speak carelessly. Outcomes diverge from plans. None of this carries disturbance by itself. Disturbance appears only when the mind adds a verdict: this should not be happening. This is the central Stoic claim, and it is uncompromising. What troubles you is not the event, but the judgment you place upon it. The moment you argue with reality, you create an internal conflict you cannot win. Reality does not negotiate. It does not explain itself. It does not yield to preference. When the mind insists otherwise, peace is the first casualty. This is not a comforting message. It removes familiar excuses. Circumstances are not blamed. Other people are not recruited as causes. Responsibility is not outsourced. What remains is a narrow and demanding truth: your judgments are yours. They are the only place where calm or disturbance can begin. Stoic discipline does not promise a quieter world. It demands a clearer mind. It asks you to see events as they are, without embellishment, and to notice the instant your mind resists them. In that resistance, peace is lost, not because something went wrong, but because judgment overstepped its role. Notice this carefully: what reality does not owe you. Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. There are things that belong to you, and things that do not. Peace depends on not confusing the two. Your judgments, your intentions, your choices, and the way you respond are yours. They originate within you and remain under your authority. Events, other people's behavior, outcomes, timing, recognition, and chance do not belong to you. They never have. Treating them as if they do is the first error that makes peace unstable. Most disturbance begins with a quiet assumption that reality owes you cooperation, that plans should unfold as expected, that people should behave reasonably, that effort should guarantee results. These assumptions are rarely spoken, but they operate constantly. When they are violated, as they inevitably are, the mind reacts as if something unjust has occurred. Frustration follows, not because the situation is extreme, but because ownership has been misplaced. Consider a simple delay. You arrive on time, prepared, and willing. The process moves slowly. Nothing is wrong with the facts themselves. Slowness exists. Waiting exists. The disturbance appears only when the judgment arises: this should be moving faster. That judgment carries an implicit claim of authority over time itself. When time does not comply, irritation begins. Or consider another person's words. Someone speaks abruptly or dismissively. The sound of the words is neutral. Air moves. Meaning is assigned. The disturbance forms when the mind adds, "They should know better," or "they should treat me differently." Again, an assumption of ownership appears. You behave as though their character, awareness, or mood were under your command. When they fail to meet that expectation, peace collapses. This confusion is subtle because it feels reasonable. You tell yourself you are reacting to facts. In truth, you are reacting to violated expectations, expectations that were never guaranteed. Stoic discipline begins by withdrawing these false claims of ownership. Not by suppressing reaction, but by clarifying authority. What belongs to you is narrow but sufficient. You govern how you interpret what appears. You decide whether to add blame, demand, or resistance. You choose whether to argue internally with what has already occurred. These are not small powers. They are decisive. But they operate only within their proper domain. What does not belong to you must be treated accordingly. You can influence outcomes through action, preparation, and cooperation, but influence is not control. Once action is taken, the result exits your authority. Insisting otherwise creates a permanent tension between how things are and how you think they should be. That tension is experienced as stress, anger, or disappointment, but its source is always the same: misplaced responsibility. Notice how often effort is wasted here. You replay conversations you cannot change. You resent outcomes already fixed. You argue mentally with facts that will not reverse themselves. None of this corrects the situation. It only drains attention and stability. The Stoic does not call this passion or weakness. He calls it error, specifically, an error about what belongs to you. This is why discipline fails when the boundary is unclear. You attempt to control what cannot be controlled, and neglect what can. You rehearse grievances instead of examining judgments. You demand that life conform instead of training the mind to respond accurately. Peace cannot survive under these conditions, because it is constantly being negotiated with forces outside your command. Clarity restores order. When something does not belong to you, you stop demanding it behave differently. When something does belong to you, you accept full responsibility for how it is handled. This does not make life smoother. It makes effort precise. It removes wasted resistance and concentrates attention where it can actually function. This distinction is not philosophical decoration. It is the foundation. Without it, every practice becomes inconsistent, and every challenge feels personal. With it, you begin to see where effort is misplaced, but not yet how disturbance takes hold, the instant the mind agrees. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. Events do not move directly into emotion. There is an intermediate step that is usually ignored. Something appears to you, an image, a sound, a delay, a remark. This appearance is immediate. The Stoics called it an impression. It arrives without asking permission. You do not choose it. You are not responsible for its arrival. What follows is the critical moment. The mind evaluates the impression and decides whether to agree with it. This agreement is called assent. It is here, and only here, that disturbance is formed. Not at the event. Not at the impression. At the point where the mind says, yes, this is bad, or this should not be happening, or I am being wronged. Impressions are automatic. Assent is not. This distinction matters because most people treat their reactions as inevitable. They say, anyone would be upset, or I couldn't help it. What they mean is that the impression was strong. But strength of impression does not remove the power of assent. It only tests whether the pause is practiced. Consider criticism. Someone questions your work or your decision. The impression appears instantly: tension, heat, a tightening in the chest. This is not yet anger. It is sensation combined with interpretation in progress. Disturbance begins only if the mind adds, this threatens my worth or this is unfair. That addition feels seamless, but it is not compulsory. It is a judgment accepted too quickly. Or consider delay again. A response does not arrive. Plans stall. The impression is uncertainty. The disturbance forms only when the mind agrees to a story: this means I am being ignored, or this is unacceptable. The story feels convincing because it explains the discomfort. But explanation is not accuracy. It is simply assent given too fast. This is why Stoic discipline focuses so narrowly on the pause. Between impression and assent, there is a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes longer, where freedom exists. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom from endorsement. You are allowed to feel tension without concluding that something is wrong. You are allowed to notice irritation without declaring it justified. Most people miss this moment because they identify with their impressions. They say, I am angry, when what they mean is, anger is appearing. This identification collapses the space where choice operates. Once the impression is treated as a fact rather than a proposal, assent has already been granted. The Stoic response is not suppression. You do not push impressions away. You examine them. You ask whether the judgment embedded in the impression is accurate. Does this event actually harm what belongs to you? Does it interfere with your capacity to choose reasonably? If not, then assent is unnecessary. The impression can remain without being promoted to a verdict. This examination does not require long reflection. Often a single question is enough: is this within my authority? If the answer is no, then distress is already a category error. You are reacting as if something external has power over your inner command. That reaction feels natural only because it has been rehearsed. Notice how disturbance accelerates when assent is given quickly. The faster the agreement, the stronger the emotion feels. This creates the illusion that emotion caused the judgment, when in fact the judgment intensified the emotion. Reversing this order is essential. You learn to let the impression exist without rushing to conclude. Understanding this mechanism does not eliminate reaction. It reveals where training must occur. Freedom is not located in preventing impressions, but in delaying assent. That delay is the hinge on which peace turns. Without it, every appearance dictates your state. With it, impressions lose their authority. Understanding the mechanism is not enough. It must be trained, training the mind without force. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They imagine discipline as pressure applied to the self. Endurance. Suppression. Forcing the mind to tolerate what it dislikes. This misunderstanding quietly undermines practice. When discipline is treated as force, it becomes brittle. It works only while energy is high and conditions are favorable. When pressure increases, it collapses. Stoic discipline is not force. It is training. The difference is not semantic. Force tries to overpower impulses in the moment they arise. Training reshapes how the mind responds before pressure appears. One exhausts. The other stabilizes. Consider how habits actually form. You do not learn to read by straining harder each time you see a page. You learn through repetition, correction, and familiarity. The same applies here. The mind is trained to pause, to examine, and to withhold assent, not by heroic effort, but by repeated, ordinary practice. This is why willpower is unreliable. Willpower depends on mood, rest, and circumstance. Training depends on structure. The Stoic does not rely on feeling disciplined. He relies on having practiced the same internal movements many times before they are needed. Discipline also does not aim at emotional elimination. That expectation is another error. Impressions will continue to arise. Irritation will appear. Disappointment will surface. Training does not remove these. It changes what happens next. Instead of reflexive agreement, there is recognition. Instead of immediate reaction, there is space. The core of this training is attention. You learn to notice impressions as impressions. Not commands. Not facts. Proposals. This shift is subtle but decisive. When the mind recognizes an impression as something presented rather than something true, the urgency drops. Assent becomes optional again. This is why Stoic training begins before difficulty. You rehearse the pause in neutral moments. You observe small irritations. You practice not adding unnecessary judgments when little is at stake. Waiting in line. Being interrupted. Minor inconvenience. These are not obstacles to practice. They are the training ground. Force waits for crisis and then tries to dominate it. Training uses the ordinary to prepare for the difficult. Another mistake is treating discipline as punishment. You miss the pause, react sharply, and then criticize yourself. This adds a second, unnecessary judgment: I should not have failed. That judgment does not improve discipline. It weakens it. It turns practice into self-conflict. Stoic discipline is corrective, not punitive. When you notice a lapse, you note it precisely. Assent was given too quickly. That is all. No condemnation. No excuse. Just accuracy. Accuracy is sufficient for improvement. Repetition matters more than intensity. One clean pause practiced consistently reshapes the mind more effectively than rare, dramatic restraint. Over time, the pause lengthens naturally. What once felt urgent becomes negotiable. What once demanded reaction becomes merely noticeable. This is how training replaces force. You stop wrestling with impressions and start organizing responses. The mind learns that not every appearance requires agreement. That lesson, repeated often enough, becomes stable. Discipline, properly understood, is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary. That ordinariness is its strength. When pressure arrives, nothing new is required. The same practiced movement appears. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life, making ordinary moments the practice. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Most people look for discipline in exceptional situations. Pressure, conflict, high stakes. But the mind does not suddenly change under strain. It reveals how it has already been trained. If practice is postponed until difficulty appears, it has already failed. Stoic discipline is built quietly, where nothing dramatic seems to be happening. The first practice is anticipating impressions without anxiety. This does not mean imagining worst cases or bracing for harm. It means recognizing, in advance, that the day will include interruptions, delays, misunderstandings, and inconvenience. Not as a threat, but as a fact. When these impressions arrive, they feel familiar rather than hostile. Familiarity reduces urgency. Urgency is what drives unexamined assent. You remind yourself, something unexpected will occur today. You do not specify it. You do not dramatize it. You simply remove the false expectation of smoothness. When friction appears, the mind is less likely to protest. It has not been betrayed. Nothing promised comfort. The second practice is pausing before assent. This pause does not need to be long. Often a single breath is enough. The breath is not used to calm emotion, but to delay judgment. It creates a fraction of space between impression and agreement. In that space, you ask one question: is this within my authority? If the answer is no, then the judgment forming around the impression is unnecessary. You do not need to resolve the situation immediately. You do not need to feel settled. You only need to refrain from endorsing a verdict that places your well-being in something external. The impression can exist without being believed. This pause is practiced in small moments. When a message is curt. When something takes longer than expected. When plans are altered. These are not failures of the day. They are the day. Each one is an opportunity to strengthen the pause without strain. The third practice is evening review without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you recall a few moments where impressions appeared strongly. You observe where assent was given too quickly and where it was withheld. This is not confession. It is diagnosis. You do not congratulate yourself for restraint or condemn yourself for lapses. Guilt is just another unexamined judgment. It adds drama where clarity is required. Praise can be equally misleading. It encourages performance rather than accuracy. The Stoic review asks only, what happened? Where did assent occur? What can be adjusted tomorrow? This review reinforces responsibility without hostility. You see patterns forming. Certain impressions repeat. Certain judgments are habitual. By noticing them calmly, you weaken their authority. Nothing is corrected by force. Everything is corrected by seeing clearly and returning to practice. These practices are deliberately unremarkable. They fit into ordinary days because they are meant to operate there. Discipline that requires special conditions is not discipline. It is dependence. Over time, something shifts. The mind stops reacting as if every inconvenience were an emergency. Assent slows. Judgments soften. Not because life becomes easier, but because attention becomes accurate. From this consistency, a different kind of freedom appears. What cannot be taken from you? Freedom is often misunderstood. Many assume freedom means ease, comfort, or favorable conditions. By that definition, Freedom is fragile. It depends on cooperation from the world. It disappears the moment circumstances resist preference. Stoic discipline rejects this definition entirely. Freedom is not about what happens to you. It is about what remains under your command regardless of what happens. Life does not become easier through this practice. Delays continue. People disappoint. Outcomes remain uncertain. What changes is not the external situation, but the location of authority. Instead of being distributed across events, opinions, and results, authority is gathered inward, where it can actually function. What cannot be taken from you is the capacity to judge accurately. This capacity does not prevent pain, but it prevents confusion. You may feel discomfort without concluding that something is wrong. You may experience loss without surrendering your reasoning. You may encounter injustice without becoming internally disordered. This distinction matters because most people confuse comfort with freedom. Comfort is the absence of friction. Freedom is independence from it. Comfort requires favorable conditions. Freedom requires discipline. One is temporary. The other can be maintained. Consider how easily comfort is disrupted. A single remark unsettles you. A delay alters your mood. A plan failing changes your self-assessment. In each case, something external is allowed to dictate your internal state. That is not freedom. It is dependence disguised as sensitivity. Inner freedom is quieter. It does not announce itself. It is present when irritation appears and does not take command. It is present when disappointment arises and is examined rather than obeyed. It is present when reality contradicts preference and the mind does not escalate the conflict. This freedom does not require success. It does not require approval. It does not require certainty. It requires only that judgment remains accurate and assent remains deliberate. As long as you can withhold agreement from false conclusions, your inner command remains intact. This is why Stoic discipline emphasizes maintenance rather than achievement. There is no final state where freedom is secured permanently. There is only continued attention, continued practice, continued correction. Authority is not something you earn once. It is something you keep by returning to it. When this practice stabilizes, you stop negotiating with reality. You no longer demand that events justify themselves before you remain composed. You accept what occurs without adding unnecessary resistance. Acceptance here does not mean approval. It means accuracy. You see what is happening without insisting it be otherwise. From this position, action becomes cleaner. You respond where response is possible. You refrain where it is not. Energy is no longer spent arguing internally with facts. It is directed toward what can actually be done. This makes effort more effective, not because outcomes improve, but because attention is no longer divided. Nothing outside you must change for this to begin. No condition needs to resolve. No explanation needs to arrive. Freedom does not wait for permission from circumstances. It operates within the boundary that has always been yours. This is not a dramatic conclusion. It does not promise relief. It offers responsibility. The responsibility to notice when judgment overreaches. The responsibility to withdraw assent from what does not belong to you. The responsibility to maintain clarity even when comfort is absent. When this responsibility is accepted, peace is no longer dependent on the world agreeing with you. It is dependent on you no longer arguing with reality. Nothing more needs to be added, returning to what is yours. The conclusion is simple. Peace does not come from persuading reality to cooperate. It comes from withdrawing the demand that it must. Every disturbance you experience can be traced back to a single moment where judgment stepped beyond its authority and attempted to rule what was never under its command. When that happens, inner order is surrendered voluntarily. Nothing in this practice requires perfection. You will continue to misjudge. Assent will still be given too quickly at times. Impressions will still feel persuasive. None of this invalidates the discipline. What matters is that responsibility is no longer denied. When disturbance appears, you know where to look. Not outward. Not toward explanation or blame. Inward, toward judgment. This is the discipline Epictetus insisted upon. Not moral performance. Not emotional suppression. But clarity about what is yours and the refusal to argue with what is not. When this clarity is present, life does not become gentle. It becomes manageable. Effort is no longer scattered across resentment, complaint, and mental rehearsal. It is gathered where choice still exists. You are not asked to approve of events. You are not asked to feel calm. You are asked to stop granting authority where none exists. That alone is enough to restore stability. When judgment remains accurate, emotion does not need to be controlled. It passes without commanding. This responsibility cannot be delegated. No insight, quote, or explanation can carry it for you. It is exercised moment by moment, in small, ordinary encounters with reality. When you remember to pause, to examine, and to withhold unnecessary assent, peace returns, not as a feeling, but as order. Return to what is yours.